Hey, I'm Chris with How to Politics. So there is some stuff going on in Los Angeles. I don't know if you've seen it. Let's break it down. So there's big protests in Los Angeles. For the purposes of our conversation, the background isn't super important. Federal agents descended on a Home Depot. They targeted the groups of day laborers that are there by the parking lot that you always see who are looking for work. So the president has talked about using force in the streets against civilians for a long time. Remember, it was Mark Esper, his Secretary of Defense, who said that he asked about shooting protesters in the legs if they didn't disperse. There's two ways of looking at this. One is as an opportunity, something Trump's wanted to do, and now he can. Another is maybe laying the groundwork for something else. We'll get back to that. So let's start with the law. There's a law called the Posse Comitatus Act from 1878. Posse Comitatus is a Latin expression meaning power of the county. Basically, it's a band of people going around and helping an official to enforce the law. In fact, that's where the word posse came from. So the Posse Comitatus Act provides that, except under circumstances expressly authorized by Congress, no one can willfully use any part of the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, or Space Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute the laws. What does the president's order do? Language is important here. Let's look at what the order specifically says. The president's order says specifically, to the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. We'll come back to rebellion. Next, the order calls for the National Guard in locations where protests against these functions are occurring or are likely to occur. So the order doesn't mention Los Angeles. The order doesn't constrain itself to any geographic area. The order could apply anywhere in the US. The president could order the National Guard into the streets anywhere in the US with this one order. Also, a quick note, the order says at least 2,000 National Guard, and they'll serve for 60 days or as long as the Secretary of Defense says they're needed. So going back to the order also says, in addition, the Secretary of Defense may employ any other members of the regular armed forces as necessary in any number determined appropriate. Whoa. Armed forces. So that means Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, or Space Force. We already know that the White House has mobilized Marines to get involved in Los Angeles. Right now, you're probably thinking, Chris, what about the Posse Comitatus Act? Right. So the government says that that law has been superseded by the law that they used in the executive order to call up the National Guard. That law allows the president to call up the National Guard in cases of rebellion. That's why the president keeps using the word rebellion. It's obviously absurd to say that protests are the same as a rebellion. There is no perfect protest in terms of violence or conduct, but we are a long way from throwing tea in the harbor. There is no assembly of a military response. There's no systematic murder of officials. Violence against property is not the same thing as a rebellion. Let's take a step back. This is not normal. Whatever clips of whatever intensity are being passed around on social media, there are no voices from cops or state officials who are saying that there is a need. In fact, the president is deploying these forces over the objections of local officials. So why are they doing it? One word, politics. We're talking about a blue state. We're talking about the issue of immigration, which the president feels emboldened about, which Democrats feel cowed about. We're talking about Gavin Newsom, who is a major potential 2028 candidate for the Democrats. And also we've got what I mentioned at the top, which is the president's longstanding desire to use the military against people he disagrees with. Whatever reason they're doing it for, everyone can agree that this is not an orderly, effective immigration policy. Do you remember Obama? Obama deported way more people than Trump. But do you remember immigration raids that sparked protests? Do you remember raids at Home Depot? Do you remember raids at job sites? Do you remember chaos from immigration enforcement? No, obviously, because none of that happened. There's a way to enforce the law that's orderly, that's rational, that's reasonable, and humane. A former ICE official pointed out that immigration agents who are going after farm workers are not investigating fentanyl, they're not investigating human trafficking, they're not investigating cyber attacks or real terrorism. They're wasting their time on abuelas who've been in this country for decades. So what is this? This is a terrible, un-American, inhumane policy that's hurting law enforcement, apparently because the president wants it. So I said I'd come back to rebellion. There's another theory as to why the president's doing this, and it can be found in his specific language. The other way of looking at it is the president might be using this to lay the groundwork to invoke the Insurrection Act, or to rehearse invoking the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act gives vast, almost unlimited power to the president to use the military almost completely as he sees fit. The law allows the president to use the military to enforce the laws or suppress a rebellion. The Insurrection Act provides, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions or rebellion against the authority of the United States, remember that, make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States, he may call into federal service and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. So remember, the order that he signed says, to the extent that protests inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. Word for word, the text of the Insurrection Act. Now, in fairness to objectivity, there are a lot of provisions in the Insurrection Act that wouldn't require the president to say magic words for him to invoke them. But it's worth noting that the language is identical. And the president's openness to this is what's causing the problem here. The president openly discussed this during the campaign. This was one of the reasons his opponents warned he shouldn't be reelected. Look, if you think this is all weird and a little scary, that's because it is. You're not alone. I feel that way too. It's hard to see now, but we have been through worse. In America, we have a deep culture of equality and justice under the law. I think knowing about it keeps us informed and keeps us able to prepare. I always say the best way to see at night is to let your eyes adjust to the darkness. We will be all right together. I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about what's going on in LA? Is the president justified in sending a military presence over the governor's objection? Are peaceful protesters guilty by association with the violent ones? Thanks for watching. I'm Chris with How to Politics.